Hi guys, I'm Chris the High Peak Chaplain, and this is BeMORE. So at the weekend we celebrated the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. Now these are two big names in the early church and big names in our Christian tradition. In fact, in those early days when the church was first starting, they pretty much between them ran things. People always either called upon Peter or Paul for any issue or any big matter relating to the church back then. I mean, obviously you've got Peter, who was the best friend of Jesus and the leader of the apostles, and he was considered the apostle to the Jews. So he was making sure that the Jewish people were learning that the Messiah has come. So come and join us and come and be part of the new Christian faith. Whereas Paul was considered the apostle to the Gentiles, and Paul made a habit of going out into communities where there was no Judaism and there were no Jews, and he would find those who were pagans or who were of another religion, and he would bring them into the fold and into the arms of Christ. Now, when we celebrate this feast, we celebrate them together. It is always the solemnity of Peter and Paul. It is never one or the other. And we don't actually have a feast of either of them individually. We only ever put them together. So why do we celebrate these two feasts on the same day? Why do we celebrate these two saints? Well, I can tell you for starters, it's not because they were best friends. In fact, Peter and Paul are quite famous. If you read through the book of Acts, there are many accounts of Peter and Paul arguing, disagreeing, and not being on the same page at all. Paul was very focused on reaching the ends of the earth and preaching the gospel to everyone, whereas Peter was obviously still held in that Jewish tradition and making sure the traditions are being taught to these Gentiles coming in. The people who weren't raised Jewish, they need to learn our ways and learn what's right and what's wrong and the various traditions and when to kneel and when to stand and when to sing and when to remain quiet. There was lots of conflict between them on a lot of things. In fact, to date, there are 3 things I can name that Peter and Paul had actually in common. The first one was that they were both executed by Emperor Nero in Rome. The second is that they were both raised Jewish men and both considered leaders of the early church. And the third one, and the one we are going to focus on a little bit in today's video, is that both of them changed their names. Both of them changed their names. We look to Peter, first of all, and Peter was actually born Simon. And when he joined the apostles and joined Jesus, he was called Simon. In fact, it wasn't until a bit further in to the story that Jesus actually says, I name you Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Equally, when we first meet Paul in the book of Acts, Paul is actually a Sadducee. He is a scholar for the Jewish faith and is persecuting Christians and calling them blasphemers and false prophets. And he's going around and he's beating and he's killing Christians. He's even accounted as being part of the first martyr's death. He was there. He instigated it. But when he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, on his way to persecute more Christians, Jesus, the risen Christ, dead and now alive again, appeared to him on the road and said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And in that moment, Paul was made blind, and later he was healed by his faith, but his entire outlook changed, and his entire focus changed. And he started going by his Latin name, which is Paul. Saul loosely translates to Paul in Latin, though both have very different meanings. And that's the big thing about names, isn't it? Names have meanings. When you give something a name, you make it unique and you make it special, and that name tells you about what it is. We name our schools after saints as inspiration. We name our children after family members or after people who inspire us. We're now going to listen to a little piece of scripture, and this piece primarily focuses on Peter and the moment that Jesus renamed him and made him from Simon into Peter. So just have a listen as Mr. Linney shares this piece of scripture for us.
A reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Peter's confession of Christ. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, Who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loose in heaven. Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ.
So as we heard in that piece of scripture just then, Jesus asks a question, Peter gives the right answer, here's your reward, new name. Doesn't overly make sense, but when you look deeper at it, it actually does, because the big thing here is the meaning of the names. See, names have meanings, don't they? We don't think about them a lot these days. Often when we name something like a child or a pet, we think of someone who inspires us, or our favourite person, or a family member who we love dearly. When we think of these different things, we pick names based on what we like and what we know and what we understand. But in the 1st century, and often right up until the peak of the 2nd century, people were named because of that name's meaning, because of what that name stood for. So, what do I mean by this? Well, the name Simon, for example, means to listen. And it's funny that, isn't it? Because how this moment happened with Jesus giving him a new name is because Peter had been paying attention. But he hadn't been listening with his ears, he'd been listening with his eyes and with his being and with all of him. He had listened to not only what Jesus said, but to what Jesus was. And he knew in that moment, I know who you are. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so Jesus said, you have fulfilled your name. You have fulfilled who you are. So now I give you this new name for who you will be and who you are also meant to be. I will name you Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So that whole idea that he's the rock, he will build the church for Jesus. When Jesus goes, Peter will start the foundations. And that's amazing, isn't it? That's almost a fulfillment of Peter's name. Rooted in his identity was this idea of listening, and then it became, be the rock, be the one that other people stand on, that other people use to build up. When we jump over to St. Paul as well, he started off as Saul, and the name Saul means to ask or to question, which perfectly suits Paul, because in his early days he was a scholar, constantly asking questions, constantly getting more information and more knowledge so he could share it. He was constantly asking and constantly questioning, and he carried on that right up to his death, when he would question things that Peter would say or the other apostles, and he would ask more questions, and he would ask people to think about this and think about this. And then he shifts his name to Paul. And the name Paul means humble or small. You see, whereas before Paul was quite a big character who was considered one of the great scholars of the Jewish faith, and he was strong and overbearing and often a little bit aggressive. After his conversion, that passion turned from an almost scary passion to a joyful passion. He speaks so much in his letters of his humility and the fact that he has been brought low by Christ, that he is not amazing and he is not perfect and he is not brilliant, but because of Christ he is enough. So again, there's that shift, there's that fulfillment of who you are and then who you are meant to be. You see, Paul saw that the way he was before, boastful and arrogant, wasn't enough. And actually, he knew that by being humble and small, Jesus would pick him up and Jesus would put him where he needs to be. So, for this week's activity, what I'd like us to do is look at our name. Look at your name. What does it mean? What is the meaning of the name you have been given? And then I'd like you to go and research some biblical names and their meanings. And maybe think about which one you would want to be called. If you had this conversion experience, if you had this moment where you felt your name was fulfilled, what would you then want to be called? What would you want to gain after that? What would you want to learn? My name, the name Christian, everyone knows the meaning of that name. It means follower of Christ. And I feel like I suit that name pretty well. I mean, I'm a chaplain, so it makes sense, it works. And it's not something I can ever fulfill, but it's something I try and fulfill every day. I try to keep that essence of my identity that I am a follower of Christ. But what else do I want to be? And I was looking this morning at a few of the biblical names, and I came across one, which is the name Azrael. And the name Azrael means, my God is my help. I want to always be confident and courageous in the fact that my God is my help. So have a look. What does your name mean? And what name would you like to almost take on? In our Catholic faith, we have a confirmation name. And that name is often a saint or a virtue that we are inspired by or want to gain. But maybe we think of this as almost our apostolic name. The name that maybe Christ will call us. Because this is what we want to be. This is who we need to be. Create a piece of artwork and maybe submit it into school. Send it to your RE teacher or send it to your head teacher or send it to me. And maybe we could share them on our social media. And maybe we could share them here on our YouTube channel as well. But have a think. My name, and what does it mean? And what name do I feel God calling me? I'm Chris, the High Peak Chaplain. God bless.